Hey everybody, it's Tasha. What you just heard is what we're going to be working on with this tutorial. A simple 4-bar intro with a lead-in, and hopefully it will help you get started editing the steel in your MIDI editor. And if you haven't checked out the tutorial on the velocity toolbar yet, I suggest that you do, because we will be using it here in this tutorial. We also have a key switch toolbar that we use for applying the key switches. It's simple, but helps a great deal when working with the key switches. Okay, before we start editing, you should know my dad wanted something simple that would be easy to use for demonstration purposes. And this simple little 4-bar intro in the key of C is what he came up with. I should also mention my dad anticipated all the slides and pitch bends that we will be editing here. And the reason I'm telling you this is so that when we select the sliding notes, you will understand why. So getting started, let's zoom in to the lead-in. And the first thing we want to do is indicate which notes are going to bend. And that would be this F4 and D4. But before we move on, here's something my dad likes to do. He likes to mute the notes that will be replaced by the slide, basically as placeholders, because they indicate how many half steps the sliding notes will need to go, as well as providing the end of the slides. So now let's extend these notes, and like I said, Dad anticipated the way things would be, so we'll extend this F4 to the next bar, as well as this D4. Next, we'll set up the proper velocities, and one of the ways we would do this is to go to the velocity toolbar, find the right string, and then experiment with the 4 timbre velocities. However, once you've worked with the steel some, you eventually gain a perspective on which of the 4 timbres might work best to get the sound you want. I should add here, generally, using more than one timbre will give the best sound. So starting with the G3, we'll go to the velocity toolbar, and since G-sharp 3 is above the G3, we'll go to the F-sharp 3 string. In this case, we'll choose a velocity of 96 for a little mellower sound. Then on to the F4. We'll give it a velocity of 116 for a little brighter sound. Now we'll give this D4 a 92, but we've determined it's way too loud, so we'll use the minus button to bring it down to 89, which lowers it 12 dB. Now on to this D4. We want it to be a velocity of 112, but it's also too loud, so we'll bring it down 6 dB to 110. And finally the B3. We'll give it a velocity of 96, but it's also 6 dB too loud, so we'll bring it down to 94. Now we need to apply the key switches. So starting with this G3, we know it doesn't slide at all, so we'll give it the main key switch, which is neutral. And by that I mean it doesn't have any pitch bending CC controllers. So on to the F4 and D4, which are both going to slide down. And as we can see here, the F4 will bend down a half a step, while the D4 bends down 2 half steps. So let's zoom in here, and selecting F4, we'll use a CC4 controller. As you can see, the key switch toolbar not only applies the key switch, but it also spaces it ahead of the note about 3 ticks. The reason for this spacing is so that contact can distinguish between the start of the key switch and the start of the note. Since my ticks per quarter note are 960, it's actually a very small spread. Also, if you notice, the velocity of the key switch is 20. Since the F4 will only be bending down a half step, the key switch velocity needs to be 10. So here on the toolbar, we'll click on the 10 button. Now on to the D4. And before we give it a key switch, notice where the cursor is. When we gave the F4 its key switch, it not only applied the key switch, but also placed the cursor 3 ticks ahead, which is a good place for the D4 to go. Now let's give it a CC3 controller. And since it needs to come down 2 half steps, it needs to have a velocity of 20, which it already has, because the key switch toolbar uses 20 as the default velocity. So on to the D4 and B3. Neither one of them will be sliding, so they get a main key switch. And since the B3 plays right after the D4, we only need to give the D4 the key switch. Now we need to put in the pitch bend CC events. But before we do, it's important to note the way the pitch bend works a CC value of 64 is a pitch value of 0. So for a note to slide up, the controller goes from 64 to 127. To slide down, the controller will go from 64 to 0. So both these notes will bend down. So let's move on to the next measure. And since we've already shown how to set up the velocities, to save time, we've gone ahead and set up all the rest of the velocities. Okay, starting with these 3 notes, they're going to slide down, but this time it will be a little different. Up until now, we've just been simulating pedal and knee bends. The pedals and knee levers on the steel guitar are attached to certain strings, and when the pedals are pushed down or the knee levers pushed sideways, their associated string will bend up a half step or a whole step, depending on which pedal or lever it is. When they're released, they bend down. So this time, these 3 notes will be simulating a bar slide down to these 3 notes. And as you can see, this E4 is 4 half steps down to this C4. This C4 is 5 half steps down to this G3. And this G3 is 3 half steps down to the E3. Since we don't want any of these notes to slide down below these 3 notes, we're going to slide them down just 3 half steps. So let's select these 3 notes, and this time use the CC2 key switch. Since we're sliding 3 half steps, we'll click on the 30 velocity button. So now let's zoom in and set up the CC2 lane. What we want to do is make a long, slow slide. So I'll start here at the 3rd beat and draw in the CC2 events. Then I'll create the curve. Moving on to the next notes. They will not be bending, so we'll give them the main key switch. Then on to these 3 notes. They will be sliding into these 3 notes. So let's mute them and extend these notes out. Now, as we can see, these 2 notes, the A3 and E3, will both be bending 2 half steps, and the C3 will be bending 1 half step. So let's zoom in. Since the A3 and E3 are both bending down 2 half steps, we'll select both of them and give them a CC4. Now let's select the C3, and first of all, slip edit it to the cursor to get our spacing. Now let's give it a CC3 key switch. And it's only bending a half step, so we'll give it a velocity of 10. Next, let's zoom in here and draw the CC events in. So on to this G3. It won't be bending, so we'll give it a main key switch. Okay, this F4 and D4 will both be bending down to these notes. So let's mute the E4 and C4, and then extend the F4 and D4 out. And as we can see, the F4 will bend down a half a step, while the D4 bends 2 half steps. So let's zoom in and give the F4 a CC4 and a velocity of 10. Now we can extend the D4 to the cursor and assign it a CC3 key switch. One thing to remember, if you want to position the notes and key switches differently, simply select them and position them wherever you want. So now let's put in the controllers. On to the D4 and B3. They will not be bending, so we'll give them the main key switch. And now over here we have something different. These 2 notes, the B3 and D3, will be bending up to the C4 and E3, while the G3 does not bend. And here's a little tip. When the notes are bending up, it's better to have the target note bend up from the lower note, rather than having the lower note bend up to the target note. The reasoning for this is that as a note bends up, it gets shorter, and there's always the possibility it can get too short. Also, there's the possibility that the note can get thinner sounding. So let's mute the B3 and D3. But here we're going to have to delete the G3. Then slip edit the 3 notes ahead and zoom in to add the key switches. Now here we'll start with C4 and give it a CC4 key switch. Then the E3 gets a CC3 and the G3 gets a main key switch. So now, before we zoom in to add the CC events, we need to add CC events right here at the front of the notes with a value of 0. Then we can zoom in and add the CC events. Now that leaves these notes here, which are going to be harmonics. So I'll bring in Dad's harmonics help image. And as we can see, the A4 looks good at a velocity of 126. And both the F4 and E4 look good at 124. So let's mute these 2 notes. Then zoom in to the front of the A4. You can see these 3 notes are extending over, and that could be a problem. However, since their key switches are main, CC3, and CC4, if we use a CC2 here, there will be no problem, because as long as the notes that are overlapping use different key switches, then the other key switches are good to go. So let's assign a CC2. And since the A4 needs to come down 2 half steps, the key switch velocity is what it should be. So now let's add the CC events. Next, this F4 will not be bending, so we'll give it the main key switch. And finally, here we have another note bending up. So we'll extend this E4, assign it a CC4, zoom in, and draw in the CC4 events, starting with the 0 events in front, then put in the curve. That's it, so let's see how it sounds. Okay, it sounds like it should. And with the next tutorial, we'll be adding the volume and vibrato to finish it off and make it sound real. Thanks for watching.